The debate over critical race theory made its way to a hearing room on Capitol Hill yesterday as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the nation's first black defense secretary both testified before the House Armed Services Committee. Two Republican congressmen pressed the military leaders about recent efforts to promote inclusion within the ranks, including teaching courses about race at military academies. Here were their responses.
We do not teach critical race theory. We don't embrace critical race theory, and I think that's a spurious conversation. And so we are focused on extremist behaviors.
On the issue of critical race theory, et cetera, I'll obviously have to get much smarter on whatever the theory is. But I do think it's important, actually, for those of us in uniform to be open-minded and be widely read. And the United States Military Academy is a university. And it is important that we train and we understand. And I want to understand white rage, and I'm white, and I want to understand it. So what is it that caused thousands of people to assault this building and try to overturn the Constitution of the United States of America? What caused that? I want to find that out. I want to maintain an open mind here, and I do want to analyze it. It's important that we understand that because our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Guardians, they come from the American people. So it is important that the leaders, now and in the future, do understand it. I've read Mao Zedong. I've read Karl Marx. I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist. So what is wrong with understanding, having some situational understanding about the country for which we are here to defend? And I personally find it offensive that we are accusing the United States military, our general officers, our commissioned, non-commissioned officers, of being, quote, woke or something else because we're studying some theories that are out there. That was started at Harvard Law School years ago, and it proposed that there were laws in the United States, antebellum laws prior to the Civil War, that led to a power differential with African Americans that were 3/4 of a human being when this country was formed. And then we had a Civil War and Emancipation Proclamation to change it. And we brought it up to the Civil Rights Act in 1964. It took another 100 years to change that. So look, I do want to know. And I respect your service, and you and I are both Green Berets. But I want to know. And it matters to our military and the discipline and cohesion of this military.
The Green Beret General Milley was addressing there was Republican Congressman Michael Waltz, the first Green Beret ever to serve in Congress. Joining us now, Andrew W. Mellon, professor in the humanities and founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, Ibram Kendi X. He's author of How to Be an Anti-Racist and host of the new podcast titled Be Anti-Racist. Also with us, award-winning historian, professor, and writer Keisha N. Blain, associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. Keisha and Ibram are co-editors of the book titled 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019. Good morning and welcome to you both. Ibram, let me begin with you and just your first blush take on what you heard from General Milley yesterday, perhaps unexpected in his defense there.
Well, first, I was happy to hear him say that he wants to understand white rage. He wants to understand what drove many Americans to storm the U.S. Capitol. And in seeking to understand that, we would be seeking to understand racist ideas. We'd be seeking to understand white supremacist organizations. And indeed, when we're thinking about those people who stormed the Capitol, some of them were people who were former military. And so I think it's important for them to root out white supremacists within their ranks. And the way you do that is by teaching about race, by teaching about equality, by ensuring that people recognize the racial groups are equals.
Yeah, I think that the important part of what Ibram is saying is that a lot of people don't understand what white supremacy may be defined as, and have these feelings and not know that that's exactly what we need to root out. So I think that what he's saying is important, Ibram, as you said, because if you don't get to the root of the problem, you can have people that just think this is a natural order because they were raised that way, they were in that kind of culture, and there's nothing racist about it. That's just the way they exist, when in fact it is a racist existence.
Exactly, Reverend. don't think I could say it any better.
Keisha, what did you think as you heard? It was fascinating also to hear sort of General Milley confront many of these congressmen and women who, frankly, were fanning the flames of that insurrection, and they were sort of smugly shaking their heads as a four-star general lectured them.
It was really great to hear. In fact, I think, quite frankly, it's one of the most powerful speeches that I've heard in defense of critical race theory. And one of the things that the general pointed out is the reality that so many people simply do not even know what it is. I'm really struck by this conversation that we're having at a national level, because I think for so many of us, we did not even encounter critical race theory until we were pursuing our PhDs. And even still, it's not as widely thought, as widely taught as people might imagine. It is truly something that is primarily taught at law schools and certainly at universities. But the fact that we're even having a conversation about critical race theory, I just find somewhat surprising. And part of it is, I think, a lack of understanding. So it was great to hear the general reinforce the point that more people need to learn. People need to actually educate themselves, as opposed to simply running around using a term that they don't even understand.
Hey, Keisha, it's Jonathan Mayer. Let me just stay with you on that exact point. This has become, critical race theory has become shorthand as an attack for many on the right. The reactions from Congressman Gates and others very representative of what they feel about this. We're hearing on conservative media as well. And I think there's a lack of understanding among a lot of Americans as to what this actually is. So beyond going to law school, what else can be done to sort of even just give a preliminary education to people as to what this means, to perhaps take down the temperature on what right now is an issue that some Republicans feel like could be their ticket back into power?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that race is a social construction, which is to say that it's not biological. It doesn't mean that it's not real in the sense that we're not having to deal with it on a day-to-day basis. We certainly do. And what we do know is that it's a historical construction. And for me, of course, and certainly for Ibram as historians, we are deeply committed and invested in making sure that people understand the history and how it has shaped our conversations and our understanding, certainly, about race in the United States, but also race globally. So critical race theory, I think, is important for helping us understand race as a social construction, but also understanding how race and racism permeates the law, as well as how it permeates various aspects of society. And the way to fix a problem is to confront it, not to run away from it. And so when we first talk about racism and we say that we want to dismantle oppressive systems, the first way to do that is to recognize what the problems are. And critical race theory will help you confront what the problems are, will help you see how racism functions in American society. And then you'll be able to participate in the process of dismantling these structures and making sure that we create a more democratic and inclusive society. So it's so important, I think, that people take it and recognize that this has to be more than just conversation, but it has to lead us to action.
And if I can just add, I think two phrases that the general used that can allow us to turn down the temperature, that can allow us as Americans to really be reflective, are the terms open-minded and the terms widely read. It is just so critically important for us to be open-minded, to think about different ways of knowing and being in the world, to assess other people's perspectives, to assess new evidence. And also, of course, in order for us to do that, we have to be widely read. And unfortunately, people are not reading people who, let's say, they may not understand or may not agree with. And that's the only way in which we're going to find some level of shared sort of understanding and shared facts.
So one of the ways in which the new Congress, is trying to change some of these structures that you're talking about is through voting rights legislation. Former President Bill Clinton is weighing in on the filibuster debate around that issue, telling late-night host Seth Meyers the filibuster needs to be suspended here to expand voting rights.
The filibuster was set up to ensure prolonged debate. It was used in the civil rights era to try to kill civil rights bills. And starting in about 1993, it started to be used all the time. And it was used on President Obama. So it's now been used to try to prevent a repeat of 2020 when we had the enormous voter participation. So all the states that are in the hands of people who don't like that and want to maintain a racial income differential are trying to make it harder to vote. I understand the president's reluctant to get rid of it altogether, and I sympathize with Joe Manchin, who's trying to, stand up for the right thing and represent people that voted more than 2-1 for President Trump. But I think when it comes to preserving democracy, I would suspend the filibuster because I think it's essential. I don't think that we should be in the business of going backwards in trying to drive down voting rights.
So, Reverend, you have the former President Clinton saying what we just heard him say. You had the former Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid basically saying yesterday that the filibuster is just a matter of time before it disappears. How much time do we have, though?
I think we're already out of time. I think that it needs to end now. Voting rights is an issue that we cannot compromise on, and for the Senate to vote the other day to not even debate it. Can you imagine those that are being disenfranchised in my community hearing we're not even going to discuss it. We're going to vote that it is beyond our interest to even discuss it.